Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And I think we'd sort of put our thinking caps on today and have a bit of a cogitate together, because it's been going on for so long now, and the lockdown for many of us has become almost normal. And while we focus inevitably upon what things are going to look like and be like when we finally get properly out of the other end, I think it's fairly clear now that it's going to be very, very hard to put a date on that. And I'm genuinely a little bit confused. Well, that's a bit of an understatement. I'm genuinely very confused by the direction of traffic, the direction of conversational traffic, but by which I mean the conversations that are led perhaps by politics and media, but which are unfolding up and down the country. And I've got some gaps that I would like you to fill in. I'll explain a little further in a moment. Also today, we should probably pay attention to the as with the Northern Irish border controls, that they swore blind wouldn't happen, and are happening. We add today to that list, I think, the food standards that appear to be, when Michael Gove swore blind that they would be sacrosanct, which I suppose we should have seen at the time as fairly compelling evidence for the idea that they would do the polar opposite. So chlorinated chicken on your menu. I shall tell you a little more about that later in the programme. But let's begin with the numbers, with the single most important statistic for anybody genuinely concerned about their fellow humans. And this one is just staggering. Let me put in the qualifications and the caveats, because they are important. The numbers are not definitive. Spain, for example, the Financial Times ran an excellent piece about why the Spanish claim that they've had no deaths for a couple of days should be taken with perhaps a pinch of salt. And equally, you know, as we discovered with our own figures, there will be movement. I think it was on Monday of this week that they announced 111 deaths, but the overall figure went up by closer to 600. So there's always a little bit of reverse engineering of these numbers. And I don't think, I mean, the weirdest thing of all is, and it's already happened, hasn't it, when you say we've got the highest death rate in the world, and then the numbers change a bit over 24 hours, and we go down to the second highest death rate in the world, and they try to sell that to us as a success. So you see it, you know, the argument is, well, you see, we're not actually. But the numbers are, to me now, almost impossible to compute. I can't quite process what's happened in my home country. 359 UK deaths, COVID-19 deaths on June the 3rd, right? Write that down if you can. 359 COVID-19 deaths on June the 3rd. If you add together the deaths in every other European Union country, again, I'll say that again, because I can't believe it. I can't believe the words coming out of my own mouth. If you're just tuning in, we've already done the qualifications and the caveats that there may be a revision to some of these numbers as we move forward. But the broad brushstrokes are absolutely irresistible. 359 COVID-19 deaths on June the 3rd, or Wednesday, if you prefer. And then you add together the deaths in the whole of the European Union, the rest of the European Union, and the total is 330. I think, I don't want to sound hyperbolic, if that's the right word to use, but something really weird is happening, isn't it? I mean, that, for me, and I don't have, for what it's worth, fantastic news sense. I wouldn't have been a very good newspaper editor, because my idea of what is a big story rarely chimes with what the rest of the industry believes. But that's why I do a very different job now. And I get to puzzle over things. I get to worry about things with you live on the radio every day. And I don't understand how that can be anything but the biggest story in town for a month or a year. I just don't understand quite what's happened. Now, on a personal level, I think there's some self-protection involved. I tried to explain about a month ago why we couldn't cover the death rate every single day, why the exercise of counting corpses and doing little else, although it seemed to me to be the most important story in town, it would have destroyed us. I mean, you'd be all right. You could turn the radio off or stick some music on or listen to a podcast or go for a walk. But if I had sat here every day for the last 9 weeks, focusing exclusively and entirely on the death rate and on the increasingly irresistible evidence that our government had handled this catastrophe worse than anybody else, any other country on the planet, possibly with the exception of America or, as things move forward, Brazil. But as things stand, comparable countries, the kind of countries that used to be on the graph that they put in the press conference every single day when it looked as if they could claim some sort of superiority or success over these other countries, it has now reached the point where 359 people died here on Wednesday and 330 died in the rest of the European Union put together. So self-protection has been some of it. There's just the idea that, well, look, there's not a lot we can do about it. It's our job to report it, but you don't want an unleavened diet of death and misery. So what we'll do instead, we'll focus upon the really big flashpoints, right? We'll focus upon the points that are really earth-shatteringly huge. And I think I realised yesterday, and it was a fairly grim realisation, but I think I realised yesterday that we've stopped doing that. We're not even doing that anymore, are we? We're not even focusing on the massive stories, the days when the statistics go almost supernova. And I don't understand why. So part of my answer is it's kind of head in the sand stuff. And that's not a criticism, actually. It's perhaps a criticism of some of the journalism involved, but it's certainly not a criticism of the consumers. The simple fact is, as the death toll mounted, as the catastrophe kicked in on a scale that nobody really expected, despite the evidence of Boris Johnson's government conducting themselves in an almost unbelievably incompetent fashion, it's too horrible to look at every day. So I get that. But on a day like Wednesday, how have we ended up in a place where we are utterly failing? And the evidence of our utter failure is completely irresistible. And yet on Wednesday, the front pages were dedicated mostly to other issues. I also understand the way that the spotlight moves, you know, that there's a kind of ennui that sets in, or a fatigue that sets in. So these reports regarding Madeleine McCann are being seized upon in a way that's probably even more enthusiastic than it would have been in normal circumstances. Her story has always been something of a catnip for newspapers. The Daily Express in particular went through a long period of not printing front pages about anything else except Madeleine McCann. But this story obviously has moved into a very important, potentially very important new phase, and I understand why it's being reported so widely. But I don't understand why that simple statistic was not. And I'm interested in your answer to that question. So it could be political, I suppose. I mean, it's very hard to remove Brexit from these contemplations because the government is built entirely upon the fraudulent bricks of Brexit, entirely and utterly. So is it, do you think, and by all means describe your own position on this, you could ring me up and you could say, thing is, James, if I take off my blinkers about COVID-19, then I'm probably going to have to take off my blinkers about Brexit as well. And I've got too much invested in Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson's sort of weird project. I know it's all falling apart, but I can't admit that they're absolutely ridiculously incompetent, because then I'd have to start worrying about the other stuff they've sold me. That's just me speculating. Feel free to poo-poo that to your heart's content. You could say that you are perhaps led by the news coverage, so you didn't even know that number until you just heard me wanging on about it this morning. And now that you've heard it, you're temporarily staggered, but real life will soon intervene. My pet theory is that the newspapers have done it to us. I'm probably wrong on that, because I'm not sure everybody else follows the newspaper agendas as closely as we do in this line of work. And people who listen regularly to LBC will be part of that constituency as well. But to my continuing and enduring shock, the entire country doesn't yet tune in to this programme at 10 o'clock every morning. So they won't yet be fully aware of all of the facts. And the reason why I ask is because that's a view from the rear view mirror. That's the view behind us. It's so important, I think, to properly process that view before we start looking ahead. So just two things. This quarantine plan that appears to be, I mean, if I described it as a dog's dinner, I honestly think that would be an insult to the good workers at Pedigree Chum. And the test and trace is falling apart at the seams already. All of these individual issues would be huge in normal circumstances. I'll give you an example. Guess what they're doing with the probation service? Remember when we started talking about the probation service about 8 years ago? People started ringing us up. Chris Grayling was in the process of privatising it, and every single person with any knowledge, understanding or expertise in the field was describing it as an absolute disaster waiting to happen. Well, 7 years after he did it, the government has sort of snuck out news that they're going to renationalise it. Same party of government, same people in a lot of the top jobs, absolutely turned upside down the probation service, and now they're going to try and undo the damage they did with your money. But hey-ho, doesn't matter. I don't get it. I really don't get it. And then all of these issues, quarantine, test and trace, whatever it may be, and he stands there in the House of Commons on Wednesday, on the day that these numbers emerged, and talks about how proud he is. What's gone wrong? What's broken, do you think? On the day that we recorded 359 COVID-19 deaths, the rest of the European Union put together, I'm going to patronise you now, because I think it's highly possible that you think my words aren't breaking through properly. So you take the number of deaths in every country in the European Union, and you add them all together, and the total is 330 on Wednesday, and the total in the UK was 359, and our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, stood in the House of Commons and talked about how proud he was of his government's response. You now see my problem. Can you solve it? 0345 6060 973. What's broken? What explains this almost... I'm going to describe it as a retreat from reality. So why are you retreating from reality? And if you can't answer that, partly because you're staring it squarely in the eye and feeling your knees knock, then tell me why you think other people are. Why are we as a nation now actually retreating from reality? I'll take any answer you've got. 0345 6060 973. We are essentially hiding in a fridge, aren't we? I wonder whose example that would involve following. Let me just add the analysis that the Times newspaper published today, in case there is any doubt, or also, of course, to avoid both you and I having to endure the contributions of people pretending not to understand things, which seems to be almost our national sport at the moment, doesn't it? So international comparisons of deaths are fraught with difficulty, and the true picture may not be known for a year or more. This is both a statistical truth and a convenient political defence. Spain, for example, seems to be excluding quite a lot of its daily death figures, and Britain looks artificially worse for being more comprehensive. Okay, so there is obviously a opportunity for retrospective revision of these numbers, but that's not really the point, because however much retrospective revision there may be, you're never going to dilute the simple impact of these two numbers. COVID-19 deaths on June the 3rd, 359 in the UK, 330 in the rest of the European Union put together. And my question for you is how has this happened? Because as a theoretical proposal a year ago, 6 months ago, if I had described to you what is now happening in the United Kingdom, you would not have believed me. I would not have believed me. Not on this scale, even after Brexit. If you'd told me that the bodies would be piling up on our islands, I'd have said, it doesn't matter how cultish you are. There's no earthly way you can believe in a lower death number than the one being published. And yet here we are. And I genuinely don't get it. And yes, it scares me a bit. Francesca is in Finchley. Francesca, what's going on, do you think?
Okay, so I really truly believe that we have been lied to by this government from the outset of this virus. We were extremely late in responding. We've been warned by Spain. We've been warned by Italy. We had the information and we followed a different path. So-called herd immunity, for which there was no scientific basis because there was no evidence, and there still isn't, that works. So I think consequently, with all the subsequent mixed messages, the reluctance to take any responsibility, the reluctance to direct the public with authority as a government in what to do, has made people feel very powerless and helpless. And I just feel they no longer know what to do because they see this happening. They see Dominic Cummings clearly, blatantly flouting the law and putting lives in danger, and no response, no reaction, no
why not?
And they're lost.
It's a heady mix, isn't it? Powerlessness and confusion. And also, without patronising anybody, people who perhaps have managed to keep their ships afloat over the last few years by repeating ultimately meaningless slogans, but at least they mean you've got something to say when the confusion and the powerlessness becomes hard to resist. You can say Brexit means Brexit, or you can say I believe in this, or you can say, all of these little pithy, fatuous phrases don't work now. You can't say, no, they're not really dead. So you just say nothing, but that doesn't explain the other half of the country, the half of the country that is still seeing reality. And I'm part of this. I'm not marching about the death toll. Why are people not, I don't want to say why aren't people angrier, because it's a very lazy question, but why is this getting a free pass from so much of the country?
Because
that's the mystery for me.
I think they genuinely don't understand. They've lost, so they don't believe the government is for the people anymore. So they don't think they have any power. I mean, what we've just seen going on in America is phenomenal, because suddenly we see people having that political impetus, but actually understanding their power. But I don't think, as a rule, we feel we have that power.
So you're splitting us into, I don't want to know the truth, I can't handle the truth.
I can't handle the truth because I know.
And then the other one is, there's
powerless.
no point telling the truth because the people in power have so completely destroyed it.
Yes. Which is
it's a start. It's more than I had. It's more than I had this morning at 10 o'clock, Francesca. I like the kind of cocktail of confusion and powerlessness, but of course it can't. None of these answers can apply to everybody because we're split so starkly between people who care about the death toll and people who apparently don't. And I don't want to exclude you from the conversation. If you somehow have found a little bit of flotsam to cling to in this sea of death and misery, what does it look like? What is it that you're clinging to keep the faith that the people in charge of us, as they tell you that they've driven to Barnard Castle on their wife's birthday because they were worried about their eyesight? What are you clinging to think, that's true? And when I say 359 deaths in the UK, 330 in the whole of the European Union, what does that plank of wood that you're clinging to look like? 0345 6060 973. Richard's in Bolton. Richard, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Thank you for having me on the programme.
You're very welcome.
I think that we're kind of suffering from... It's like a post-Brexit... it's almost like a narcissism, isn't it, really? It's this very notion that, we're going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. And, nothing bad can sort of happen here,
But here's the number. I mean, I like this. It's more exceptionalism than narcissism, isn't it? This idea that never mind the laws of gravity, we're English, so we will float, or we will, we'll pull it off, and we'll do this, and they need us more than we need them, yada, 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 yada. I get that, and I completely agree with you. But what is exceptional about Boris Johnson's handling of this catastrophe is how awful it has been. So... do you see what I mean? You've sort of turned the egg timer the other way around, and I don't understand why people haven't noticed. If this is exceptionalism, it's exceptionally awful.
Well, yes, I absolutely agree with that, and I think it doesn't. It it doesn't really help when you kind of have, like you say, such dreadful figures, presented. And somebody like Boris turned around and said, "I'm completely proud of it."
We're proud of it, and this is the week in which he said he was taking back control of the strategy as well. I mean, this is actually beyond satire now. I wonder whether, listening to you, it occurs to me, Richard, that perhaps there's an absence of a rallying point. You know, I mean, you mentioned Brexit. I think inevitably, although I'd be happy to hear from people who think they can somehow disassociate the two issues, the Vote Leave government's handling of the coronavirus without it having anything to do with Vote Leave. But there's no rallying point. Remain is finished. You know, that war is lost, even though a lot of people on the other side still don't realise.
Yeah.
So where do you gather that we haven't had any effective opposition in this country for 5 years? Keir Starmer has made a good start, but he's not exactly a maypole yet around which a significant swathe of the country is ready to dance. So is it just that there are millions of us in isolation, both literally and politically, sitting there watching this complete horror show and not knowing where we get a sense of solidarity from, because no one is actually cheerleading, apart from a couple of people on the telly or the radio, no one is actually cheerleading for reality. Nobody, God, there's a phrase. Write that down, Richard. Nobody is cheerleading for reality.
I will do, James. Yes, certainly. Well, yeah, I think I absolutely agree with you. I think.
Where do you go? Where do you go if you? Yes.
The strongest thing that Keir Starmer has said to date is, get a grip, and we kind of need more of that. But
probably a little more. Yes. No, I'm with you. I'm going to crack on. I look forward to your next call, but I've got a lot of people waiting to talk. I want to squeeze in at least one more before the news. David is in Sunderland. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. What it is, I work for one of the coronavirus test helplines.
Oh yes.
And to be honest, I'm really annoyed with the way the government's reporting, on the success, as they call it, of the testing system. I noticed yesterday it wasn't said this is how many tests have been carried out. They said this is how many tests we've mailed today. But I spend every day speaking to people where the tests either don't get delivered or the tests get delivered, they do the tests and they don't get picked up. And the amount of care homes that I've never spoken to a care home yet who have had the tests collected, and when we give them the email that they've got to contact, I've never spoken to one person where they've even had a reply from that email.
So they come to work. They come to work and they look at facts and figures and reality, and they simply think to themselves, "How can we carve this up in a way that makes us look good or makes us look less bad?" They're not actually doing anything else any day.
It's got to be that, because why all of a sudden, yesterday, they said this is how many tests we've mailed. They didn't say this is how many tests have been completed. I think I can answer that. I think that's because the Office of National Statistics gave Matt Hancock an almighty rocket for the way that these statistics have been presented to the public. I don't know for sure. I wasn't paying attention yesterday to what you described, but that might be a reason they thought, well, we're not going to get away with this anymore, lads. But that's even more evidence, Richard, of the madness, isn't it? Because they do it, they get caught, they change the way that they're doing things and just carry on as normal, as if they hadn't done anything wrong in the first place. But people are not picking up on it. They're not lying.
Well, exactly that. People aren't picking up on it. I know.
How many we've mailed is not a lie.
I know. And two people one person having two separate tests, been counting as two tests, isn't technically a lie either. And the reason why they talked about capacity and tests rather than people tested, we now know. But it's. Well, at the very, very least, it's been economical with the actuality. Richard, thank you, and keep me posted, actually. We should probably talk again if you're in the eye of the storm like that. But the question today remains, how can they be getting away with such an objectively measurable, catastrophic conduct during this crisis? Not just how are they getting away with it, how can he stand up and claim to be proud? It's 10:31, and some early answers to this question of what's happened to us include the combination, the cocktail of confusion and powerlessness that creates an environment in which half of us, I don't. Obviously, this is a very loose breakdown of numbers, but half of us can't handle the truth, partly because of Brexit. You can't even begin to admit the scale of the incompetence currently being displayed by people like Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Michael Gove. They were supposed to be geniuses. Imagine if you'd spent your life savings on beans that they said were magic, right? And you were just beginning to think, what if they're not magic at all? I've spent my life savings and my children's life savings on these magic beans. So I can't yet begin to contemplate the possibility that they're not just mediocre or middling. They're catastrophically bad at this stuff. That I think is part of it. And then the other half, perhaps a feeling, well, look, there's no point. Again, maybe this is part of the legacy of the last 4 years. What's the point? You know, someone like me, I might sit here today and say, look, I told you that there would have to be border posts on the Northern Irish border. I told you there would have to be. And you were really rude to me, and you called me all sorts of names. Look, I told you that there's no earthly way America would contemplate any form of free trade agreement with us unless they were allowed to sell us their filthy, cheap food. And you were horrible to me, and you called me horrible names and accused me of lying and not knowing as much about things as Jacob Rees-Mogg does. And it's all come true. So maybe people like me, and I don't mean people in the media, I mean people in normal life who've just watched everything that they knew to be correct be proved right, even as the people who swore blind they were wrong stay silent. I don't know. Is that it? Is that part of it? I mean, it is genuinely staggering what we're seeing here. 0345 6060 973. Charles is in Butland in Surrey. Charles, your turn. What do you think has happened? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, you got that right. My thought is that you lose it in numbers. The difference between 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. When it's somebody you know, or it's your family that's died.
Yeah.
So when they smugly put the chart up and say, oh, look, the numbers are coming down, at the end of the chart, what we should do is put the names of all the people that died today to bring focus. But all this nonsense that we've been talking about, Cummings and all the rest of it, it would be good to get back to realising how many people and how many families and friends are affected by all this.
I'm minded to agree with you, but I am reminded that I think the New York Times did something with this. I think they put 1,000 names, one for every 100 dead, with a little line of biography. It was among the most powerful newspaper events that I have ever seen, and yet America is not that dissimilar to Britain at the moment. That attempt to put names on it, albeit in one newspaper, I suppose, if you were still consuming an unleavened diet of Fox News and internet darkness, you wouldn't get through to it. But yeah, it would be nice to see, and of course that would involve the government doing the right thing, doing the decent thing, properly respecting the memories of the dead, and they can't do that because then the finger of blame looms ever closer to their noses, doesn't it?
They are very like watching spitting images. If they brought the programme back, they just wouldn't need the puppets. You just
Well, they wouldn't need the script writers either. They could just do it as reality TV and do it as a fly on the wall. So have you lost anyone close to you? Do you mind me asking you that?
I live in Buckland, and there are about 250 houses, and we have 50 volunteers coordinated to collect prescriptions and food parcels. It was just heartening to see so many people that we didn't know come out of the woodwork and say, we'll help.
Yes, well, I mean, you know that people are fundamentally decent. We just give so much airtime and promotion to people who are professionally and performatively indecent that you're right, that is something of a silver lining to see community. It's the same around here. The WhatsApp groups have gone into overdrive. And forgive me for if this is an uncomfortable question for you. Have you lost anyone close to you yourself?
No.
No, you see, I haven't either. And I do wonder whether it would sound as plausible to someone who had, that if we knew the names, the response would be different. But I mean, again, in the absence of anything else, it's going on the list. They've turned the people into statistics, but even the statistics are staggeringly awful. So it's never going to do the whole job. Charles, thank you. 10:39 is the time. Mike is in Leighton. Mike, what's happened to our country?
Well, James, you know, I've been listening to you for the last month, and I've heard you get more and more sort of depressed on this, but, you know, you shouldn't really, because you're actually doing a good thing. You're actually exposing what is going on out there. Now,
no, I'm not. I'm asking what is going on out there. It's a big difference.
Well, you know what's
and
going on.
I'm not depressed for the record, except on behalf of people who are burying their loved ones, sometimes over Skype.
Well, look, there's a lot to be depressed about right now.
Well, that's for sure.
Actually, I'm depressed that Britain kind of gave the image that they were prepared for this pandemic, because we did know this was about and what have you.
Yes.
Okay, so it seems like they weren't prepared. Well, why wasn't they prepared? Because, you know what, it might be more useful for this to kind of come out and do what it's got to do, and then we can social isolate, and then we can, it's about our human rights. This has been work.
But it's too late. It's too late. No, you're right. I mean, and we will continue to catalogue and chronicle the specific instances of epic incompetence and lethal misbehaviour. But now, today, June the 5th, looking back to Wednesday, 359 deaths in the UK, 330 in the whole of the EU. Prime Minister standing up in the House of Commons.
Boris he's proud of that.
Yeah.
And he's told you that. He's told us all that.
I know. So why are people still waving their flags at him?
They wanted a herd immunity. Well, we are like a herd at times. We're like a load of sheep sometimes. You see what I'm saying?
No, I don't, Mike. I don't see what you're saying. I know what blind tribalism is, but not when people are dying. I just would never have thought that was possible.
James, people die all the time, and you know what? This is exactly it. They want, when you can get 10, 20, 30,000 people die, and everyone not really think about it that hard. Oh, yes, they die. Well, I haven't. It just reinforces our own selfish media. Well, we're alive. Well, they're all frontline workers, and most of them are. Some people kind of happy with what's going on right now. Same thing in America, and not everyone's going to rise up. And so some people are like, well, yes, we need this, and it's just, you know what? We're at a pivotal moment in our history, I feel. Because the virus was there, and now the race issue's been stoked right back up again, and what have you.
Yes.
So, it's a moment in. You get these little moments sometimes, don't you? And what have you. My only fear is that we don't just all go back to sleep, but I don't think we will. I think it is too late for that, because
I don't want to douse your optimism, but I was reading something that Clement Attlee said about Churchill in 1945 about the relationship between wealth and labour, and how they tell us it's all about freedom of the individual, but it's actually about enslavement of the poor. I can't help it. He's a clever man.
No, James. No, you know what the thing is? A lot of people know this, but they're just so caught up in it. They're like, the apathy is real. It's tangible. If you get this moment when your consciousness just snaps and you realise that you've been living a total lie, and that's it. And
most people will resist that moment. Many people will resist that moment with all their might, I think. Mike, you're right. I look forward to talking to you again. Anybody who is downcast by events, and you'd have to be slightly odd not to be, wouldn't you? I'd recommend yesterday's Mystery Hour. It was like injecting happiness straight into one's veins. It really was a bit special. 10:43 is the time. That's that. I mean, it's all coming together, but there's nothing that actually unlocks this state of confusion. And I wonder whether it is. I mean, my problem is, of course, that I'm neck deep in the politics of the last 4 years, so I can't perhaps separate the two, and maybe I should. But is it just about the personalities? It's so odd, isn't it, that the names you list as the worst offenders, Jacob Rees-Mogg making a mockery of the Parliament he spent his entire life fetishising, and he'll not be punished or penalised in any way, shape or form. Boris Johnson going on holiday at the beginning of this crisis, presiding over the worst death toll the second biggest death toll in the world, and pretty much, I think Belgium is an anomaly here, but it's we're in the top 2 for deaths per million. Today, today we look back to Wednesday and see that we are burying more people every day than the rest of the European Union put together. This week he claimed he was taking back control. Did you cheer that? Did you nod along with that? Give me a call and tell me why. On Wednesday he stood up and described his pride in the way that he has performed, or the way that the country has responded to this. It is as if the most powerful people in the country are appearing on our television screens every single day and telling us that the earth is flat and the moon is made of cheese. And a significant swathe of the population, if not all of us, actually, wherever you stand on other issues, we seem to just be nodding along. And I don't get it. A few little thoughts on the question of what has happened to our country as we survey a government responding to the coronavirus crisis in a way that genuinely opens the door to the question of just how could things have gone any worse? Like, that's an astonishing question, really, to be asking. How could things have gone any worse? We could have followed the Swedish model, I suppose, like a lot of people suggested. They have finally acknowledged that they would do things differently if they had their time again. But, of course, our government can't do that. There is something, endemic to Boris Johnson's personality that it makes apologising or admitting a mistake something that he is incapable of contemplating. Quite incredible, really. And then, as in America, it's really the shock of the moral vacuum within the people surrounding him, people that you might have thought, would you believe, you're going to laugh at me now, I have said warm words, not just about Matt Hancock in the context of the early days of this catastrophe, but also historically, regular listeners to the programme will know, I used to have quite warm words to say about Michael Gove. I think solely because we're both adopted. And when he spoke about education reform, he described things that I would have really, really thrived on. And then, of course, it was, as ever, for me, it was you and your calls that made me realise an education system that would really suit someone like me, or Michael Gove, was not necessarily an education system that would suit the country, the population, or even a majority of school children. So my belated thank you for that wake-up call. But how do these people sleep at night? How do they actually sleep at night? What happened yesterday? What happened on Wednesday, boss? Well, we lost 359 people to COVID-19. How did other countries do? Well, we're not supposed to be talking about other countries, are we? Well, no, but how many? Well, if you added up every other country in the European Union, with the usual caveats and qualifications, they'd have a total that's 29 bodies lower than ours. And what we're going to do tomorrow? Oh, we're going to give Matt Hancock a big cake because he started the horse racing again. Do you see what I mean? You do, don't you? I'd love to speak to someone who doesn't. How do you sleep at night, still cheering for these people as the corpse count continues? And of course, the two numbers, this spike yesterday was relatively good news. Maybe that's part of it. Describing 176 daily deaths as relatively good news is part of the process we're describing. But if the 324, 359 spikes on the second and third, if they do trace back, as many suggest, to that false loosening, to that bogus loosening, to the newspapers trying to trumpet Boris Johnson and VE Day and all that kind of thing, then who knows what the next couple of weeks are going to hold. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you're bored of my voice and would rather hear your own, 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Ian's in Glasgow. Ian, what's happened? What's going on?
Well, I think there are a few people that alluded to it already. You know, there's an element of blind tribalism. You know, that's
still
from Tory party voters and certain elements of the press. I think you've mentioned one of them. And a big chunk of it's apathy, and a lot of people have lost faith, not only in the government, but their fellow electorate. So when you think that, you know, Jacob Rees-Mogg said what he said about Grenfell Tower, Boris Johnson said these things about, you know, Muslim women letter boxes, amongst various other things that we've just not got the time to compare it to. Yet they still got voted in.
Smiling Piccaninny's lives matter. I think that's the T-shirt he's wearing this week.
Exactly. But people will probably forget about all of that in 4 years'
They
time.
don't just forget about it. They defend it. People passionate. People love what Rees-Mogg said about Grenfell Tower. People love what Boris... Otherwise, they wouldn't have said it, you know. Maybe not Rees-Mogg. He's not bright enough. But Johnson knew exactly what he was doing when he threw some red meat to the Islamophobes and the racists. But that wouldn't make you apathetic about a body count, about a death toll, would it? Would it?
It really shouldn't do, but it does make people kind of go, well, I got angry about that. Lots of people got angry, yet
what's the point?
This chap still managed to get a majority of 80.
What's the point?
And you compare it to, almost 30 years ago, where allegedly Neil Kinnock lost an election because of a video of him falling over on a beach. Back then that was what lost people votes. Nowadays, people are able to say what they like almost and tell lies and still be voted.
Or Ed Miliband eating a bacon sandwich. I think the Kinnock thing is more historically recorded as giving a victory rally before he'd actually won, which reportedly turned a lot of people off. But if you look at what the Sun newspaper was doing back then, the idea that any election in this country in living memory has been a fair fight is a complete mockery. But I still, and I'm a student of everything you describe, ad infinitum, ad nauseam even, but I still wouldn't have believed you a year ago if you'd said, and I wrote a book about the dangers of Brexit and Donald Trump, among other things. So I'm no flipping innocent on this one, Ian. If you'd said to me, no, they're so delighted with what they have been given, which is essentially lies and racism, that they won't even get angry, they won't even lose faith when their countrymen and women are dying on an unprecedented and entirely avoidable scale. I mean, it's the more you think about it, the more staggering it becomes. It's not one of those subjects that diminishes in stature the more you contemplate it. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Maybe that's part of it, mate. Maybe it's just so huge and awful that many people, and this is why you use the word apathy, many people would just look the other way and try to get on with their lives and just hope that it's all over soon, and however many people die, there's no point making a fuss. Good
I think the rest of us, though, yourself particularly, and your platform, we need to not give up. And I do worry that with things like the Madeline McCann story, whether you love or loathe football, the Premier League comes back soon, that they'll use this as a chance to bury bad news. And
well, it's already buried. It's already buried, Ian. Look, I mean, this number here, Wednesday for me is a big day. June the 3rd, 2020. The Prime Minister of these islands stood up in a House of Commons that had been rendered an absolute laughingstock by a leader of the House who has spent his entire ludicrous existence pretending to fetishise and understand the importance of parliamentary tradition. The Prime Minister stood up in a House rendered an international laughingstock and claimed to be proud of the government's response on the same day that we learned 359 people had died of a disease we were warned about at exactly the same time, and the rest of the European Union had 330 deaths. How hard do you have to dig? How hard do you have to work?
The public are just like pawns on a chessboard to these guys. So they say,
I mean, again, I'm sorry to labour the point, but then I'd start shouting at you or at them or at whoever we're discussing today. I say, well, surely you don't want to be a pawn on a chessboard, and not just a pawn. You know,
listen, I'm with you, James. I'm not.
I know you are. We're just trying to work it out.
It's the end of it. It's the other people that you think, oh, come on, get a bit of fire in the belly.
Yeah, well, I've been on a charity mission with a lot of these people for the last few years, but I suspect even they now just think, oh, crikey, just please let it all be over soon. And I don't just mean the COVID-19 catastrophe. I mean the Brexit mess as well. We're going to have to deal with being proved everything's going to be proved wrong that we voted for, and oh God, idiots like O'Brien are never going to let us forget it. Well, why can't we just all? Yeah, I know. The only way back to normality is reality. That there can't be any other way back to normality except reality. And coronavirus has given the most compelling evidence yet that they hate reality. They retreat from reality. They hide reality from the rest of us. And of course, largely because of the absence of opposition to this government, to successive Tory governments since 2015, There is no rallying point for reality. There are no cheerleaders in politics yet for reality. Ian, thank you. Whether Starmer is adjudged to have got it right by not going in harder sooner, I don't know yet. But you know, it's only this week that he's girded his loins to give Boris Johnson the kicking he clearly deserves. And yet, what about a month ago? What about 2 months ago? The points at which we could have actually done things that would have seen this death toll considerably smaller than it is today. And let's squeeze in John in Eastbourne. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I think, especially listening this week and everything that's happening around the world, you've done it yourself. And I think the problem is with the country, like you've asked, is that we cannot physically admit that when we're wrong. We can't do it.
But actually, that's true of most countries. I mean, I think that the post-Holocaust Germany is an incredible exception to this rule, but that's because the Holocaust is an incredible exception to ordinary history. So that the way that they atone and teach and recognise that the only way to prevent a repetition of that sort of thing is to acknowledge and teach it. But I don't know if it's a uniquely English or British thing. Is it to hate saying sorry, to hate admitting that you've got it wrong?
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess you're right. But if we are looking locally, and if I am sort of looking at my own experience, you know, I come from a working class background. My mum and dad were both trade unionists, and the champion of those were probably when Jeremy Corbyn ran for leader, and I voted for him as a member of the Labour Party. And when that went backside over breast, I was not afraid to say what a mistake that was. And I'm in group chats, and I sort of say, wow, look at this disaster that's going on. Look at what Boris Johnson is doing to the country. Look what Jacob Rees-Mogg is saying. Look what's happening. And I get a response that is,
well, it's all your fault for not keeping the faith with the last Labour leader.
Yeah, where's your bulldog spirit?
It's incredible, isn't it? There's two types of people that I think are probably the most dangerous in the political space at the moment. The people saying, oh, it would have been brilliant if he'd been in charge, and the people saying, well, imagine how much worse it would have been if he'd been in charge, because both of those lines of argument distract us from what is actually happening and what is actually unfolding in front of us, in front of our very eyes.
The response I get that's most frustrating is, well, at the time it was anyway, Corbyn wouldn't be doing a better job, would he?
Yeah.
And I just sort of think, well, I've outrightly, categorically condemned Corbyn for his performance over the last even 3 years.
They can't compute you. They can't compute you because you don't have a football scarf tied so tightly around your neck that the flow of oxygen to your brain has been cut off. And I'm very grateful to you, actually, for bringing a bit of balance to the scales, because this blindness, this cultishness is not confined to pro-Brexit right-wingers. You do see a lot of it in the constituencies that John described, and yet you'd think that they would be even angrier. How could you look at the death toll and instead of thinking, my God, we've got to go after these people like it's going out of fashion, and instead think, well, yes, that proves I was right about Jeremy Corbyn. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I honestly don't know who's worse. Thank you, John. A little roundup of today's news, and I guess depending on where else you go for information and analysis, some of this may surprise you. So here is one story. The government's test and trace system for those with COVID-19 may not be fully operational until October. Its chief operating officer has admitted. October. British Airways is toying with the idea or thinking of pursuing legal action against the government over a quarantine scheme that makes no sense to anybody. You put in quarantine when there is a risk of people coming into a relatively well-protected country from a relatively less protected country. We are literally doing the opposite. We've got still one of the highest infection rates in the world, and yet we're thinking we should quarantine people coming here. Face coverings are to be compulsory on public transport from June the 15th, something that, of course, the Mayor of London was calling for at least a month ago and possibly longer, but he was told that he was stupid. Why June the 15th? Why not today? Why not yesterday? I don't know. Ask Grant Shapps, a man that used to use false names to sell get-rich-quick schemes on the internet. This is our country. This is the United Kingdom. A man who used false names to sell get-rich-quick schemes on the internet. He's in charge of telling you what you should and shouldn't do with regard to public transport. Having told you that face masks were useless or pointless, or Sadiq Khan should sit down and be quiet, or shut up and go away, as Gavin Williamson would have put it, they're now saying that they need to be compulsory on public transport. Which means that the teachers going to the schools that have reopened will have to wear face masks on public transport and then take them off when they get to the schools. I haven't finished yet. I haven't even finished yet. You've got the test and trace not ready till October. You've got the quarantine making no sense to anybody. You've got the face masks signalling yet another U-turn. Too little, too late, almost certainly. And then MPs could be asked to swap the conga line for the self-checkout queue, with plans being drawn up to abandon the system of queuing to vote only a week after it was introduced. Again, those words. I wonder who said, let's put Jacob in charge, said somebody somewhere in the last month. That almost sums up England, doesn't it? Who should we put in charge? Well, let's get the haunted pencil, put him in charge of something relatively complicated. And there it is, less than a week in place, and it's already falling apart. So much so that Brexit hardman Steve Baker filmed himself describing it as a complete farce and then went to vote for it. This is not... these are not isolated incidents. This is evidence of a broken country, a broken government. This is evidence of a regime that is completely unfit for purpose. And I would love you to try to deny that. I'd love you to tell me that none of these things aren't true. Or if you can't do that, then tell me why they don't matter as much as I think they do. Month 6 of the coronavirus catastrophe, Boris Johnson announces that he's taking control of it. Taking control of it. The day on which we record more deaths than the rest of the European Union put together, Boris Johnson announces that he's proud of how we've done. And the reason it matters, apart from the death toll, the reason it matters is that they're still in charge. They're in charge of the test and trace system that the man running it says might not be ready till October. They're in charge of the quarantine that seems to defy all the laws of logic and threatens to destroy the last vestiges of our travel and tourism industries and our airlines. They're in charge of the plan to bring face masks in over a week from now, 10 days from now, when 2 months ago they were poo-pooing the idea that they might be a very good idea. And don't forget that every country in the world that made face masks compulsory from the get-go has done rather better than us. I mean, the real tragedy, of course, is that you can remove half the words from that last sentence and it still holds true. You could say every country in the world has done rather better than us. The only country with a higher death toll is America, but they, of course, have a much bigger population. And this question of why? What is happening? What is happening? I just would love to know what you think. You're very kind to listening to my pontifications, but I'd love to know what you think. How has this happened to your country? How has your country been made a place where, essentially, do you remember Comical Alley during the Second Gulf War, during the Iraq War? One of Saddam Hussein's, for younger listeners, Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq, whose alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction was one of the main platforms for going to a war. Weapons he turned out subsequently not to have. But the war was a very strange exercise in news management. Again, the death toll was incredibly high, and again, perhaps we focused on different things than we should have done. But today, I look at the government, I remember the guy that they called Comical Alley. So this was a government spokesman. He could probably get a job in the White House now. And he would stand in front of the world's television cameras describing how well they were doing. And after a while, it became so ridiculous that buildings were actually exploding and burning behind him while he was describing how well they were doing at preventing the bombing of the buildings that were burning behind him. That's where we are, isn't it? Albeit, thank God, with a much smaller death toll than the Iraq War caused. We are now governed by Comical Alley. We've got 10 Comical Alleys queuing up to tell us everything's fine. What are you going to do today, Priti Patel? Quarantine. Who for? People coming into our country from countries where the infection rate is lower. Pardon? So you come into the United Kingdom from a country where, let's say, there haven't been any deaths, and you have to go into quarantine in case you're bringing in something that we need protecting from. Yeah, that's the latest plan from the Comical Alley government. Face masks. Even the House of Commons has been completely rendered ridiculous by the same people. It's the same people every time. So give me a call and give me a reason to be cheerful. Where are we going next? Have we spoken to Jonathan in Eastbourne yet? Jonathan, what would you like to say?
Yeah, at the moment, we're in a perfect storm.
Go on.
Previous generations of politicians went into public service out of a sense of duty, and they had a sense of honour.
Let's not get too rose-tinted about it. There were always a few wrong ones, but I agree. My sense is the same as yours. Whether you're looking at a Dennis Healey or a Michael Heseltine, or generationally speaking, there was a sense that they went into politics for the people, at least in part, rather than solely for themselves.
They were ambitious, but there was a line, and when you crossed it, everyone in Parliament said, "That's it, you've got to go."
Yes, that's true.
We've got a group who are in it more for self-gratification. They put personal career above honour and above truth. And this sort of led into Brexit, Trump, and an idea that somehow the truth didn't really matter. What mattered was your flavour of the truth. And they encouraged people that, although everyone's entitled to an opinion, they encouraged this idea that all opinions were equally valid. That somehow the logic you used to argue with a bloke down the pub was perfectly suitable to argue with an expert in a field, an epidemiologist.
And if you pointed out why he was spectacularly and categorically wrong, you were infringing his freedom of speech.
Yeah. And then those people stopped looking for news, they stopped looking for the truth, and they started looking for means to validate their existing opinions by going to sites that echoed those opinions, and that just gave them more and more belief that they were right.
Which explains how we got here, but not why we are here, if you see the distinction. Because, however,
absolutely.
I'm going to imagine that I had been a Brexiter, right? I had thought that we would be coming out of this process richer, with stronger security somehow, with the only immigrants we'd have in the country would be PhD students with £1 million in the bank. I don't know. I'm just trying to kind of imagine what it would feel like. And Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, they're my boys. Look, they've delivered it. Yay! Now I look at the death toll, I look at the absolute chaos surrounding quarantine, surrounding test and trace, and this is looking forward, not backwards, not even looking at the mess thus far. I'm looking at the death toll on Wednesday, test and trace, quarantine, face masks, the failure of the lockdown, the loosening of the lockdown, the mockery of the House of Commons. And I don't know if any of them will ring me, but what are they clinging to now? What is it that they get from the loyalty and the deference that the rest of us simply cannot see? What is it?
I think the issue was that Brexit led to tribalism. There were clear divisions between degree-level educated, non-degree-level educated, young and old, those living in cities, those living in the country.
Again, I'm sorry to badger the witness, because this is the distinction I'm trying to draw. I get all of that, but COVID-19 doesn't respect tribes. In fact, arguably, it kills more of the people in some of the categories you've just described than it does in the other categories. So how come this hasn't opened the curtains, is what I'm asking.
I think that tribalism led to people basically throwing their lot in with one group or another. And now we're in this giant fairy tale of the Emperor's New Clothes. If you admit that you got it wrong, then you're somehow admitting you were stupid, or you were duped, or you didn't understand something.
And perhaps even more importantly, all those scumbags that you've been screaming at for the last 4 or 5 years, it turns out they were right all along. And I simply can't ever admit that, because I've invested so much of my very identity in calling them horrible names and accusing them of not knowing what they were talking about.
Exactly. You can't take all of that back.
I'm not too simplistic.
I think there's a lot of pride involved in not being willing to review changed evidence and
here's a quick question. A quick question, because I'm short of time. Okay, Brexit never happened. There was no referendum. There was no result. There was no Brexit. Somehow, by hook or by crook, Boris Johnson ended up in Downing Street in December of last year. Fast forward to January, coronavirus happened. This catastrophe, this chaos unfolded in precisely the way that it has done. I know there's a lot of variables here, and I know the idea of Johnson getting into Downing Street without being propelled there by the lies of Brexit is a big ask, but it wasn't impossible. He was talked of as a future PM long before leaving the European Union became reality. So would we now be having public protest, public fury, public disapproval on an unprecedented scale if he'd got there without the boost of the Brexit fraud?
I think probably yes. I think probably we would have been in a different political world. The papers would have...
Where some of the old rules still applied.
Yes, and they wouldn't have been able to clear house of all of the old politicians as they did during the last general election. Kicking out the old guard, anyone that dared raise their head above the parapet and say, well, hang on a second here, this isn't why I joined the Conservative Party. They cleaned house. Be
interesting to know. I mean, I need to change my act slightly because I used to be bombarded with calls from the kind of people that we're both talking about, and now I think they're all in that enormous fridge that Boris Johnson just found during the election campaign. Because I suspect you're right. Obviously, it tallies with my worldview. But if there's another reason why you think people aren't criticising Boris Johnson on the scale that logic demands they should be, that doesn't involve the dreaded B word, then I would love to hear it. It's 11:17. It's 11:19. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue collectively to just marvel at what they've somehow managed to do to our country. As is often the case, of course, the worst atrocities and abuses visited upon a population are often brought in by people claiming to be protecting a country or making it great again or taking back control of it. These are, of course, key constituents of the fascist toolbox. But rarely do things fall apart quite so quickly. That is, of course, what coronavirus has done. It's brought a searing sodium light into British politics, and it has revealed Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings to be worse than incompetent. They actively make things worse than they would be if they stayed in bed. That's the incredible thing. The ludicrous attempt to bring in herd immunity by letting coronavirus pass through the entire population displayed not just a callousness and a carelessness, but a level of competence that would, well, frankly, stand out in kindergarten for its unfitness. And yet here we are watching it in Downing Street. And I presume that the perception of genius is still built upon the referendum result. And yet, of course, as everybody now knows, the referendum result was built upon lie after lie after lie. So if you win a big argument by lying, you're not a genius, you're just a really, really big liar. And now here we are with these men in charge of our response to COVID-19, which is, it's certainly in with a very good chance of going down in history as the worst on the planet. The worst on the planet. And yet on Wednesday, he stood up and told you he was proud of how they'd done. And presumably half of us went along with it. Doffed the old cap, tugged the old forelock, gave him a little wave. Oh, good old Boris, he gets things done. And I don't get it. And I don't think it just peters out. I don't think you can return to normality until you return reality. And this entire government seems to me to depend upon the continuing denial of reality. And you know, it's not just retrospective. All of the stories emerging now, whether it's the state of the House of Commons, the compulsory face masks on public transport, the quarantine that might not be ready, the quarantine that makes no sense to anybody, and the test and trace that might not be ready until October. Tracy's in Colville. Tracy, finally, you're going to make sense of this. What's going on?
I think that the government are so far from reality, they're on the moon. I'm a frontline worker and actually work in a hospice. I can't say which one for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But if the government one of those politicians sat with one person that dies of COVID, they would see and become more realistic about what's happening, instead of standing in front of that billboard every day telling us that they're getting it right. They're not getting it right. If I did my job like they've done their job, I'd be struck off for incompetency.
Imagine if you'd been in charge of a new queuing system at the hospice and you did what Rees-Mogg did this week. Your feet wouldn't touch the floor. You'd be out on your ear before you could say, "Oh."
Exactly.
Do you know anyone who goes along with it? Because I had a chat earlier this week with a older family member who still is. We kind of agreed a truce on it because otherwise we'd fall out forever. But they still come out with lines like Boris Johnson gets things done, and you sort of say, well, yes, death on a scale that no other country on this planet has seen. That's what he's got done. So I don't. I could usually understand even while disagreeing, and I could usually understand how someone ended up in a position, even if I could prove personally to them that it was wrong. But I've lost it on this one. I can't, it's just like it's disappeared over the horizon. Have you got any people who still wave the flags, Tracy?
We're up in arms. When Matt Hancock comes on every day, we want to scream at him. He's telling us that we could track and trace, we could be swabbed. We waited months to be swabbed. Then we came back with negative results. We all had it because the swabs were done incompetently at different places. The antibody test we asked about yesterday, there's now a problem with that, with backlog. We're frontline workers, we're dealing with it, and we are left so exposed to this virus. It is unreal. And our patients...
30,000 have gone. 30,000 have been flushed down the toilet after being sent to some laboratory in America that muffed it up because we didn't even have the... So they were telling us about the capacity that they had achieved without telling us that they were sending tens of thousands of these tests to laboratories in America. How are they getting away with it?
I don't know. And they're led by all these professors on huge... I've never seen so many professors come out on that television that know so much about so much and do nothing and stand there and say they're proud that 35 and probably 50,000 people have died. I'm not proud if one person died.
It's incredible, isn't it? That word proud. I mean, I don't know if it was pre-prepared or whether it was just another unscripted belch from Boris Johnson, but to use the word proud. But he's playing, if it was deliberate, to an audience that usually applaud him, isn't he? And if I say I'm proud of it and you have got your eyes tightly shut and your fingers in your ears and you're programmed simply to nod and cheer at the right moments, maybe it still works. It must do, looking at some of the polling. It must still work.
It's horrendous. What has happened in this country, absolutely horrendous. And nobody's addressing the real issues that affect the real people. They sit in their political bubbles with their millions of pounds and they just don't give a damn about us or the people that are affected.
Everything is about to get infinitely worse for reasons that are actually voluntary. That's the incredible thing. Nobody voted for coronavirus, but the Brexit that's coming along on the back of it was the will of the people. It's an interesting time to be alive, Tracy. Thank you for the work that you do, by the way. I hope you are managing to take some care of yourself as well as taking care of the people that you care for in the hospice, because those claps on Thursday night, in retrospect, are going to look terribly inadequate once we conduct the audit of what has gone on. 26 minutes after 11. John's in Maidenhead. John, can you unravel this? Astonishing. I mean, it's the UK. We're not talking about Robert Mugabe or some country on the other side of the world where the dictator has put a statue of his mum up in the town square. This is the United Kingdom. This is our home, and it's gone bonkers. Do you know why?
I'd like to say I've got an idea, but I don't. I'm sure there's way better reasons when you delve into them. Funnily enough, I think what you just said is exactly the problem. The British developments and the British advances in lifestyle, in our capability to do anything, daily. You can go here and you can do this activity. You can go there. You can buy that thing any day, any time. We have so many freedoms. We have so many luxuries.
We can choose our truths as well. We can choose our truths like we choose an ice cream flavour. It's
almost like a perfect storm of everything we've spent a lot of time and effort building over the decades since the war has then come together to mean that, well, we must be better. And we must, so the choices we make must be better. And I've sent you a couple of messages over the past few weeks, and there was a time I called in to say something. I had to jump off for a meeting. But one of the things that I'm wondering is that in the back, and I've heard you dismiss this in the last couple of days, and so I'll be careful here. But yes. I do think that someone somewhere has a grand plan, and that this is part of it. Now, I do feel like if they have got a grand plan, some of it isn't going to plan, and some of it isn't doing very well. But ultimately,
I'm not going to bite your head off, but you genuinely think that somebody somewhere in Westminster, and most people would reach for Dominic Cummings simply because of the way the narrative has unfolded and the ludicrous loyalty shown to him by Boris Johnson, which makes sense in very few contexts, except perhaps this one. But you think he is sitting there welcoming the death toll? Because I just that's a river. That's a river I can't cross.
Okay, so I don't think welcoming the death toll is the end part of the riverbank he wanted to land on, but I do think there is a part of that riverbank where it was inevitable, and in 5 years' time we'll look back and there'll be an amount of this that we will realise back then or in the future that back now was unavoidable, and we don't know what that quantity is right now. We don't know about things like second wave.
Okay, let me put it into slightly more digestible language. You think even now there is a view that says, well, look, this is a price worth paying for what we will do next?
Well, so the short version, and I know it's going to rear up, so I'll be careful, is yes. But there's a couple of reasons why. So on LBC, I've heard a guy, and I think it was from Bristol University, has a professor who explained his modelling, and obviously there's lots of models going on, and some of them more accurate than others, but his modelling showed, I think it was 6.4% drop in GDP will do more damage on its own than if we did nothing. Now, This, I don't think, has been put front and centre enough to help people understand to go back to work.
Yeah, but then we're living in a country where people were claiming by the end of 2016 that they absolutely voted for a massive reduction in GDP.
You're about to get me started. You're about to get me started. So
actually wanted it. This is a country. Yes.
So the economic sanctions that people have essentially voted for is something that I find as mind-boggling as yourself, and I don't feel anywhere near informed enough to even understand how bad it is.
Well, no, but you don't need to. You've taken me up to the headlines, John, so I shall wish you a lovely weekend. But that's a really good point, actually. Maybe, you can't get cross about the reduction in GDP if you've spent the last 4 years pretending that you wanted a massive reduction in GDP. You hear the news about Bentley today. However much that has to do with what's gone on and what the path ahead looks like, Nissan confirming that if it's a no-deal Brexit, their business here becomes unsustainable. You've spent so long pretending that you wanted all these things that, I don't know, maybe it is that simple, that now you can't actually get genuinely cross about anything that the people who sold you all that snake oil have gone on to do. I'd like to throw open the phone lines to American callers in the next hour of the programme. And again, actually, in the spirit of what we're still doing now with regard to the United Kingdom, I'd like you to explain to me things that I think are more comprehensible than perhaps the questions I'm asking about the UK. I'm looking at some of the footage emerging from America, and I just want to hear from Americans about why this happens. So, I mean, If we, God, I suppose it is something to be grateful for, isn't it? If I do, as I may well next week, if I do a phone-in on the question of, can you imagine any way in which Boris Johnson could have handled this worse? Let's have a little think about that over the weekend. How could he have actually handled it worse? And I'd ban a couple of answers, like you couldn't ring in and say, well, he could have gone on holiday for even longer. And you couldn't say, well, he could have been Donald Trump. But Donald Trump now has ordered the firing of tear gas at peaceful protesters in the capital of the country he governs. And that's quite incredible. And yet, as I have feared for some time, and I know you have as well, or at least if you didn't, you've heard me fear it, it's a boiling frog exercise, this kind of politics. It's not... Michael Rosen puts it best, the poet about fascism doesn't arrive in jackboots. It arrives in carpet slippers, promising to be your friend, and then suddenly they're gassing their own people, peaceful people, on the outskirts of the White House. So I can't ask you that question. How come America hasn't gone bonkers about the fact that the president is now gassing peaceful citizens? But some of the footage that's emerged, both from police and civilians, does make it seem to me more than ever that we are very, very different. There's two countries divided by a common language, I think, was Oscar Wilde's pithy description. It's no time for pithiness. I would like American callers just to tell me about some of the things that we're seeing coming out of America, because we're clearly profoundly different cultures in ways that perhaps many people on this side of the pond have never fully appreciated, because the only America we ever see is the big cities, if we see it at all. You know, it's the East Coast and the West Coast, and yet the country that elected Donald Trump bears little resemblance to the I go with metropolitan elites that we describe, which translates simply as people who live in cities, I suppose. 24 minutes to 12, but we continue for the time being, at least, with the question of what the hell has happened to us? What has happened to the UK? And how have we ended up in a place where, if I was reporting upon a foreign government's performance in the context of coronavirus, we would be united. We would all be singing from an identical hymn sheet and just expressing profound sympathy for our Italian or our French or our Spanish or our German cousins. We'd be sitting here saying, have you seen? There were more deaths in Germany on Wednesday than in the rest of the European Union combined. I had a tweet from a listener in Spain who says that, do they still teach maths in the UK as becoming something of a catchphrase among her friends? And Spain's had a nightmare in this crisis as well, but compared to us, it's incredible, isn't it? We would be sitting here probably with a little bit of exceptionalist superiority, you know, a little bit of smug quasi-xenophobia. We'd be going, well, yes, you might beat us at penalties, but we've beaten you at the actual really important business of keeping people alive. But we're not. We're looking at the UK being very close to the worst in the world. And most of the media, and I don't have the conversations I normally have because I'm working from home at the moment, so I don't get it either. Most of the media is telling you to look the other way or to, I don't know, talk about something else or oh, don't worry, or use your common sense. The worst, among the very worst political performances on the planet. That's what we've got in charge. And yet still, many people either can't or won't or refuse to see it, and I want to know why. Janet's in Cambridge. Janet, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me on, James. Always
welcome,
make me
Janet.
Smile, you do, actually.
That's the main thing.
You
That's the main thing.
always do, and it's always a good conversation, so thank you. I think there's a few things for me.
Yes.
People are switching, so, the optics that I'm hearing are that people are switching. So I know a pure Brexiteer absolutely can't see further than the end of their nose with regard to Brexit. She's changed and she's joined the Labour Party because of Keir Starmer, I think.
Right.
People who I know at work who have always been, Boris is the best thing, what a wonderful guy, oh yes. They're changing. Could have managed to pee up in a brewery better, that sort of thing.
No.
So, so I think things are changing. So
the plural of anecdote is not data, of course, and the polling doesn't land full square behind you, but the movements of the polling suggests that what you describe is widespread.
Which is heartening to hear, to be fair.
Yes.
I think that the hubris of the government is extraordinary. That they don't mind what they do because they've got another 4 years.
Yes, that's a huge part of it. That's a huge part of it. And even with no deal Brexit, if by the time another election comes along, they will be hoping that a lot of the worst elements might have been overcome or at least forgotten, or they'll be able to pretend that the state of the economy, the jobs market, has nothing to do with the no-deal Brexit that they ended up lumbered with.
It's interesting, isn't it? They criticised Labour heavily for having no money when they got in. Well, they didn't have any money because, for part of the reason, was because we'd had a global financial problem.
Yes, that was all Gordon Brown's fault, though. You've clearly been reading the wrong newspapers. Gordon Brown caused the global financial crisis in 2008.
But, it's the same sort of thing, isn't it? But we are still going to have those people who have got blind Brexiteers, have got blind faith in the government.
But why now, though? Because I know it's a laboured question, and it possibly interests me more than it interests many other people. But now, that figure for me, I'm a big fan of penny drop moments. I never shut up about them. But 359 deaths in the UK, 330 deaths in the rest of Europe put together. I mean, if it was the second worst country, if it was 359 in the UK and 330 in Italy, it would still be bad. But the fact that that's every single country added together, I honestly would have bet my house on that setting everything off. A year ago, I'd have bet my house on that set. It's a good job that Mrs. O'Brien doesn't let me bet the house on anything. But if I did, I would have done. If you'd said to me, a year from now, we'll be in the middle of a global pandemic, and on June the 3rd, we'll have 359 deaths in this country, 330 in the rest of the European Union added together, do you think that will be the moment at which the country finally comes back together and calls these clowns out for the fraudulent facilitators of carnage that they so clearly are? And I'd have bet my house on it.
And who would have said that Germany would be turning around to their people now and say, don't go to the UK, please? Which is what they're doing. Yeah. Don't go to the UK. We don't want you to come.
It's not just Germany. There's 3 West Indian Test cricketers who've said they don't want to come and play cricket here because we are.
What's that saying about us? I mean, we're a laughing stock. But the other thing about the hubris is there's been no need to follow our rules. Sharma standing there ill at work.
Well, he has been tested. It's not COVID-19, thankfully.
But have gone in.
Well, obviously not. But that was Jacob's folly, wasn't it?
Yes.
That was Jacob's big idea.
And it's interesting that Lindsay Hoyle is completely against the fact that they've gone back. But, Rees-Mogg holds the...
Well, it's an 80-seat majority, so Brexit hardman Steve Baker can film himself standing in a queue describing it as a complete farce and then go through to vote for it. In a way, that sums up everything, doesn't it?
And the other thing is that they don't bother to consult with organisations before they make changes. So, for example, great, the dentist's going to be back next week, but they're not. Because they weren't consulted beforehand, so they haven't got the appropriate PPE, which, of course, the NHS isn't releasing to them. So, they can't.
It's a good job. It's a good job the dentists don't have a half-decent trade union. Otherwise, they'd be getting it in the neck for actually knowing what they were talking about and refusing to tug along with the right-wing media and the government, like the teachers had to.
Why would we trust experts, hey?
Yes, indeed.
I think the other thing for me is mistaking scrutiny for criticism.
Yes.
This idea that actually you can scrutinise something without being, critical. That the complete defensive.
Well, you take a half-wit on social media who thinks that if somebody says something profoundly wrong, usually racist, and you point it out, the kind of person who argues that you're somehow infringing or compromising their freedom of speech when they mean freedom to lie. Just like Donald Trump, actually, so we don't have to confine ourselves to civilians. You could use him as an example of a half-wit on social media who tells a lie. It then gets pointed out, in his case by Twitter, and his response is to threaten to shut down Twitter. That's not his freedom of speech that's been impinged upon, it's his freedom to lie. And I think you're right, it has now, on this side of the pond, it's become a government policy. If you point out that we're lying, you're a traitor. That's the next step, isn't it? That's the next kind of tool in the fascist toolbox. If you point out that we're lying, you're a traitor.
Said, if you lie to people long enough, they'll believe you.
Yeah.
And who does this remind you?
But on this one, how does it work here, though? Because you can count the corpses. That's the problem.
No, it's tragic. Absolutely.
But so how does that work? How does it work, Janet? If you're one of those people and you can see the bodies, almost, metaphorically.
I don't understand it. You know what? I can't even put my mindset into it, James, because I'm not like that. I can't even think how people can doubt things. I
envy you. I envy you. I can't help it. I want to worry it. I'm like a dog with a bone on stuff like this, partly because I think people...
James, we need people like you, because we need... And this is what the other thing I was going to say is actually, what shocked me, I'm not a Boris fan at all in any respect, but the fact that he shut people down last week on those questions, that he told a reporter, he told scientists not to answer. You know,
yes,
who is he to do that? That shut down debate, shut that. I mean, you think about the lies he told when he was in Brussels reporting.
Yes, but that was funny then, almost. I mean, you could see.
Actually fine, wasn't it? You know, and it just makes me really. You know, I heard a really good thing on Question Time yesterday, and it was.
There's a phrase you don't hear. There's a phrase you don't hear very often these days. Go on.
And it was a guy, and he was saying it was from Southampton, and he was a white young man, and he said we need to be educating people in this country. Well, it was about Black lives and about how, as an country, we've, you know, our Black history. But actually, we need to educate people about the history of the politics since post-Thatcher. You know, I was no fan of Thatcher, but she wouldn't have had this shambles.
No, she categorically would. Well, she was a trained scientist as well, so she would have had a very, very different approach from these classicists and historians and PPE people and former get-rich-quick salesmen. I'm glad I put a smile on your face, Janet. I've got to be honest, because there's a lot of reasons not to be smiling at the moment, so I'll take that as my favourite compliment of the week, and I hope you have a lovely weekend. It's 11:46. In the next hour, we will move our attention away from these islands to the other side of the Atlantic and just try to make some sense, if we can, of these videos that are now emerging from the United States, showing, in most cases, police brutality on a scale that I just don't get or recognise, but also members of the citizenry, civilians, normal people behaving in ways that are frankly staggering. The one I found most disturbing was a fully grown man assaulting a young girl who was putting up Black Lives Matter posters. And he kind of charged at the lad with the camera phone using his bicycle. It's an adult. These are strange times indeed. Sort of good news of sorts from the Office of National Statistics, as you heard a moment ago. We might still be among the worst affected countries in the world with the second highest death toll on the planet, but infection rates are, mostly coming down. Matthew Thompson, LBC's senior reporter, is here to pick over the latest numbers. What have we learned, Matthew?
Good and bad news, James, I think it's fair to say, in these ONS releases this morning. There's two significant reports today from the Office for National Statistics. The first one looks, as you say, at the numbers of people currently infected with coronavirus, and it suggests that the number of people with COVID-19 in England essentially halved during the month of May. So 53,000 people in England had the virus at any one time during the last 2 weeks of May, according to these ONS report, and that is down from their previous estimate, which was 133,000. And so they say that there's now a consistent downward trend, to use their statistical jargon, but basically 0.4% of the population had it at the end of April, and now that's down to about 0.1% at the end of May. So that's the good news. What the ONS hasn't done yet, James, is change its assessment of how many people have had the virus since the beginning of the outbreak, essentially based on antibody testing. So that number, our best estimate for that, is the one they published last month, which is about 7% of the population. Presumably it will be slightly higher now, but we don't know exactly how much higher. And then the second important piece of work from the ONS, which is slightly less good news, is analysing the number of excess deaths. So excess deaths are deaths above the 5-year average, and they from all causes. And they're widely thought to be the best metric for doing international comparisons of death figures. And you're right to say that we have amongst the worst in the world, possibly the worst in Europe. I think currently second behind only the United States. And the ONS says that there were nearly 47,000 excess deaths in England and Wales between the 7th of March, so around the beginning of it, and the beginning of May. So first thing to note, that number will be significantly higher now, of course. Yes. But the important thing is, of those 47,000 excess deaths up to the 1st of May, more than a quarter of them, 28%, weren't related to coronavirus. And the vast majority of those were amongst elderly people, many with conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia. So there have been loads of theories over the last few weeks about why that might be the case. Why are these people not dying from causes other than coronavirus so far above the average? And so the ONS posits, I'm afraid, James, the glaringly obvious one. They may just be undiagnosed coronavirus cases. There are other theories, perhaps, a restriction or denial of medical care to those with more urgent needs is certainly one. Also, stress and things like that can have impacts on Alzheimer's and dementia as well. But frankly, the ONS says that to really understand what's going on, it's just going to take several more months and much more data.
Indeed. And one of the interesting things about and I don't know if you would be able to help me with this, but when we read that it could be a year before these numbers are fully understood, and I mean, Spain is held up as an example of a country that is arguably leaning in the opposite direction from us, and their number is likely to increase as time goes. What sort of variables are they looking at, Matthew, when they say things like, what are the issues that might see the numbers be retrospectively revised?
Sure. So in terms of the analysis of the deaths due to dementia and other causes not due to coronavirus. So one of the things that they say is that there's a lot more information that still needs to come out that they would need to analyse. So it might be things like the full impact of treatment delays. We don't quite know what those have been yet to the NHS services. Also, there's a huge need for things like coroner's inquests for deaths. So, if there have been deaths caused by drugs or violence or suicide or anything like that, those figures, because there hasn't been a coroner's inquest yet, those will not be reflected in the data. So in terms of looking at that percentage of 28% of deaths, excess deaths that aren't COVID related, there's still a lot more information that could come out in the coming weeks and months that will allow statisticians to look back at all the data and make a better assessment of exactly what has caused those deaths, not due to coronavirus. But as I say, the glaringly obvious one that the ONS said is that they may well be to do with coronavirus and they were just undiagnosed.
Matthew Thompson, LBC senior reporter, many thanks indeed to you. 4 or 5 minutes left before the 12 noon headlines. After that, we will turn our attention to events in America where there's a hashtag on Twitter, if you know what that means, police brutality pandemic. And if you click on it, it is frankly breathtaking. Some of it won't be real, or at least some of it won't be stuff that's happened in America over the last few days. You know how easy it is to manipulate social media, but an awful lot of it is. Police are being suspended, arrested, charged, and it to an English eye, it makes no sense. But I've got some insights into the difference between policing in America and policing in the UK. But I don't have enough. I want to hear yours, particularly, of course, if you've spent time in both countries, then you would be able to tell us, or perhaps to address the confusion we feel as a nation that is, for all its myriad faults, policed by consent. And we contemplate a country that appears to be policed by, Neanderthals in large part. Before that, one or two more answers to the question of what's happened. How can you look at the numbers? How can you look at the performance in this country and feel anything but horror and disgust at our government? And it's almost as if they're throwing me evidence and ammunition while I'm live on air. 39,904 deaths is the current official figure. It is obviously widely considered to be much higher than that. And Jacob Rees-Mogg half an hour ago decided today would be a good day to put a joke about his haircut on Twitter. And that's what we're up against. So what is it that the rest of the country can't see? When we see facts, reality, evidence and ghouls, what is it they see and why? Dean's in Essex. Dean, what can you tell us?
Oh, hi, James. Thanks for having me on.
Very welcome.
So I thought I could provide some insight into a Conservative voting Brexiteer, and
someone who's still in the gang, as it were. Someone who's still cheering for Johnson.
Yeah, so it's actually someone I live with. So they.
I thought it was going to be you.
No, it's not me. No, just to be clear. So he built a very successful business, which he's now sold, and he's now enjoying a very comfortable retirement. And obviously, throughout this lockdown, I've been watching the press conferences with him and PMQs, and he's very honest about what's happening, and he admits that it's an absolute horror show. So after Wednesday, after PMQs, we were having another debate about it, and I said to him, "What would you do if there was a general election tomorrow?" And he said to me he would still go to the polls and vote for the Conservatives. And I said, "Why is that?" And his response was, "Because I believe the Labour Party would come after my wealth." And I was a bit taken back, and this is someone who's read the Daily Mail his whole life, and I think it shows almost the mountain. We've got a client.
I don't care how many people die, as long as I can hang on to my money. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's what he told you, really.
Yeah. And
gosh,
this is the mountain that someone like Keir Starmer has got to climb over the next 4 years. Once stuff like that is embedded in you, I don't know how you can change people. And I think that there's a lot of silent Conservative voters around the country. That's how we ended up with an 80-seat majority.
Yes, but they're not. Very few of them are going to have your mate's wealth.
Yeah.
Are they? I mean, because there's at least there's a logic to that level of selfishness. Although he's in for a bit of a shock when it comes to filling the coffers that have been emptied by the furloughing scheme. That can only really involve taxation. There's nothing left to cut. But the millions and millions of people who haven't got a pot to pee in, who still tug the forelock, they're even more of a mystery, aren't they, than the ones who are just protecting their personal wealth?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot of people like this in the country.
Probably, yes, in the southeast. I mean, and I mean the fact that Brexit is going to make the country poorer. Do we know how he processes that fact?
No, not really.
I don't want to ruin your domestic arrangements, Dean. I mean, you've done enough, and everyone will be speculating about what your relationship with this fella is. But I think I know. It's coming up to 12 noon, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. In the next hour of the programme, we will turn our attention to an avalanche of footage coming from America of police behaving in a way that, if it was in Russia, again, we're back to that meme, aren't we, if that's the correct use of the word. If it was happening in a country that we have been conditioned to look upon as dodgy, we'd be up in arms about it. We'd be talking about invading if this was happening in Iraq. But it's happening in America. So how do we make sense of it? How do you explain it? I think I've got some beginnings of an answer to this. I'll share them with you after the headlines, but I am, as ever, more interested in yours. It's 12 noon.